War didn't just kill, it rearranged humanity itself. When armies moved, people moved with them willingly or not. Behind every battlefield victory or defeat was something deeper. Entire populations uprooted, identities reshaped, and bloodlines forever altered. Take the Roman conquests. As Rome expanded across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, it didn't just impose power, it blended people. Soldiers settled in foreign lands, local women bore children with invaders, and over generations, entirely new identities formed. What began as occupation became ancestry. Centuries later, the Mongol invasions reshaped DNA on a massive scale. The empire stretched from Asia to Eastern Europe, leaving behind not just destruction, but a genetic footprint still visible today. Historians and geneticists estimate millions of men carry a lineage traced back to this era. Not because of peace, but because of conquest. Then came one of the most brutal transformations of all, the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken across oceans, stripped of identity, language, and heritage. But their bloodlines did not disappear, they adapted. In the Americas, African, European, and indigenous lineages mixed under violent conditions, creating entirely new cultural and genetic identities that still exist today. Even in more recent history, wars like World War II didn't just redraw borders, they displaced over 60 million people. Refugees fled across continents, prisoners were relocated, and entire populations were resettled. Children were born in foreign lands, often between people who would never have met outside of war. This is the hidden layer of history. War as a force of human remixing. Not all of it was by choice. Much of it was survival. When communities collapse, people adapt. They marry across cultures, adopt new identities, and pass those changes into the next generation, not as history, but as DNA. That means your ancestry might not just be a story of origin, it might be a story of collision. A soldier who never returned home. A refugee who crossed borders. A family forced into a new world. War didn't just decide who lived or died. It decided who met. And in those meetings, often painful, often forgotten, new bloodlines were born. So when you look at your identity today, you're not just looking at heritage. You're looking at history written in blood. Before wars scattered humanity, identity was something you could stand on. For most of human history, people didn't move far. They were born into a land, grew within it, and were buried in the same soil. Life revolved around familiar rivers, forests, and seasons. Generations followed the same paths not because they lacked curiosity, but because stability was survival. In places like Mesopotamia, early farming communities formed some of the first stable societies. Families cultivated this same land for generations, passing down not just crops but identity. The same was true in ancient Egypt, where life was anchored to the rhythm of the Nile. Year after year, flood after flood, people stayed rooted and their ancestry reflected it. This pattern repeated across the world. Among the Yoruba people of West Africa, lineage wasn't just remembered, it was preserved through oral tradition, names, and family structures. Identity was tied to ancestry, and ancestry was tied to place. You didn't just know who you were, you knew where your people came from. In ancient China, under early dynasties, like the Shang dynasty, communities were organized around kinship and territory. Clans stayed close, intermarried within known groups, and maintained strong genetic continuity over generations. This wasn't isolation, it was structure. Low mobility meant that people married within nearby communities. Over time, this created distinct genetic patterns, clusters of shared traits, appearances, and even resistance to certain diseases. Your DNA wasn't a mystery. It was a map that pointed clearly to your origin. Language, culture, and biology moved together as one. The way you spoke, the food you ate, the rituals you practiced, they all reflected a lineage that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. Identity wasn't something you questioned. It was something you inherited, clearly and directly. Even in regions with trade, like along early routes before the Silk Road fully expanded, movement was limited compared to later eras. Most people still lived within a narrow geographic range, reinforcing deep-rooted connections between people and place. And because of that stability, families became living records of history. Elders carried stories not just of events but of bloodlines. Who married who? Which clan came from where? These weren't just traditions, they were systems of identity preservation. Before large-scale wars disrupted this balance, humanity existed in pockets of continuity. Clear, defined, rooted. Your DNA, if you lived then, would not be a puzzle. It would be a straight line linking you directly to your ancestors, your land, and your people without confusion. Before war blurred the lines, identity was something you could trace without question. Before war, people knew where they belonged. After war, that certainty vanished. When conflict erupted, the world of rooted communities shattered. What had been generations of stable living, the fields, the rivers, the familiar paths to school, market, and temple, was suddenly gone. Homes became ashes, villages became ghost towns. Cities that had thrived for centuries collapsed in smoke and ruin. The earth itself seemed to shift beneath human feet. History is full of these upheavals. Take the Viking invasions, for instance. Communities along the coasts of Europe were uprooted as raids swept villages. People fled inland or across seas, sometimes never to return. Families were separated. Ancestry that had once been tightly linked to a specific place was scattered across new regions, creating a ripple effect that would last generations. Centuries later, the Mongol invasions forced millions to move. Entire towns were destroyed, and survivors were often relocated by conquerors. Population shifted hundreds of miles, blending with local groups, and forever altering the genetic map of Eurasia. Language, culture, and bloodlines began to mix in ways that were unintentional, but inevitable. Forced displacement was not always about conquest alone. The Atlantic slave trade represents one of the most extreme examples of populations being moved against their will. Millions of Africans were uprooted, transported across oceans, and resettled in entirely foreign lands. They lost not just homes, but a geographic sense of identity. Their descendants would inherit fragmented histories, languages lost to the passage of time, and DNA interwoven with people they would never have met otherwise. Even in more modern history, wars like World War I and World War II forced millions of refugees to cross continents. Families were separated, cultures disrupted, and cities emptied. People often arrived in foreign lands with nothing but memories of what was lost. The stability of identity that had been grounded in geography was replaced by uncertainty. This is the turning point in human history, displacement as a force of transformation. Before war, people's ancestry reflected where they lived. After the war, ancestry became a mosaic, fragmented, dispersed, and recombined across regions and populations. War didn't just destroy property. It destroyed the ties between people and placed the geographic anchor that gave identity its meaning. It scattered bloodlines and left future generations with legacies they could not trace easily, except in stories and, eventually, in DNA. In this chaos, humans adapted. Survival meant blending, integrating, and redefining identity. But the cost was immense. Entire geographic and cultural footprints erased or rewritten. War had begun, and with it, displacement changed everything. The world would never look the same again. As movement reshaped the world, something deeper began to happen. Strangers became connected not by intention, but by circumstance. When displaced people arrived in unfamiliar lands, they didn't just pass through. Many stayed. They settled among those who spoke different languages, practiced different traditions, and carried entirely different histories. At first, there was tension, uncertainty, even distrust. But survival has a way of breaking barriers that culture once held firm. In the aftermath of events, like the migration period, entire regions of Europe became crossroads of human interaction. Tribes once separated by distant Scots, Vandals, Franks collided, settled, and eventually blended. What began as invasions slowly transformed into integration. This pattern was not limited to Europe. Along routes like the Silk Road, movement driven by both trade and conflict created layers of human connection. Merchants, refugees, and former enemies found themselves sharing space, exchanging not just goods but culture, language, and eventually, family ties. Children born in these regions carried mixed ancestry that reflected entire continents. But not all unions were formed in peace. In many cases, especially during conquests, relationships were forced. Power dynamics shaped human connections in ways that left lasting genetic impact. During expansions like those under Genghis Khan, entire populations were absorbed into new social structures. Over time, lines between conqueror and conquered blurred not because history softened, but because generations adapted. In other regions, survival required cooperation. Displaced families depended on local communities for shelter, food, and protection. Alliances formed. Trust was built slowly, and from that trust came relationships that would redefine identity for future generations. This is how DNA began to mix not as a single event, but as a continuous process. Every migration route became a thread, every settlement became a meeting point, and every child born from these encounters carried a new combination of histories within them. Cultural exchange followed closely behind. Languages merged, traditions blended, and new identities emerged, ones that no longer belonged to a single origin, but to multiple. What makes this transformation powerful is that it was rarely planned. It was driven by necessity. People didn't set out to redefine ancestry, they were trying to survive displacement, rebuild lives, and find stability in unfamiliar worlds. But in doing so, they created something entirely new. Interconnected human lineages. Over time, the idea of separate identities began to fade. Not completely, but enough to change the course of history. Because once bloodlines mix, they cannot be unmixed. And what began in the chaos of war became the foundation of modern diversity. Strangers met under pressure. They adapted under struggle. And in the process, they became family. Not all changes came from survival. Some of it came from power. War did not only bring people together, it also placed them under control. And in that control, human identity was often reshaped in ways that were deliberate, systematic, and deeply violent. Across history, conquest has carried a hidden layer, one that goes beyond territory and into the structure of populations themselves. During expansions like those of the Mongol Empire expansion, entire regions were overtaken and populations absorbed. While some integration happened over time, many relationships were not formed by choice. Power dictated proximity, and proximity led to generational impact. What followed was not just political dominance but biological influence that still echoes today. In the Americas, the European colonization of the Americas brought even more structured systems of control. Indigenous populations faced violence, displacement, and forced assimilation. European settlers imposed new social orders where identity could be erased or redefined. Children were often raised within imposed cultures, their original languages and traditions intentionally suppressed. The transatlantic slave trade represents one of the clearest examples of forced mixing. Enslaved Africans were stripped of autonomy not just over their labor, but over their bodies and futures. Generations were born into systems where relationships were controlled and identity was fractured. African, European, and indigenous ancestries became intertwined not through mutual exchange, but through systems of dominance. This is the darker side of genetic change. It wasn't just that bloodlines mixed, it's how they mixed. War created environments where consent was often absent, where power replaced choice, where human beings became part of strategies, tools for expansion, control, and population restructuring. In some cases, entire bloodlines disappeared. Small communities, already fragile, were wiped out through conflict, disease, or forced integration. Their languages vanished. Their cultural markers faded. And over time, their genetic signatures were absorbed into larger populations no longer visible as distinct identities. This wasn't always immediate. It happened slowly, across generations. A name changed, a language forgotten, a tradition no longer practiced, until eventually, what once defined a people became almost impossible to trace. Even in more recent conflicts, such as World War II, acts of violence and systemic control affected populations in ways that extended beyond the battlefield. Forced labor, displacement, and abuse left scars not only on survivors, but on generations that followed. This is the truth history often avoids. That's not all human connections came from unity. Some came from suffering. And yet, even in that darkness, those bloodlines continued. They carried forward not just pain, but resilience. Today, the past is no longer buried in books. It lives inside you. Your DNA is not just biology, it is a historical record. A living archive shaped by movement, survival, and conflict across centuries. Every strand carries fragments of decisions made long before you were born. And many of those decisions were made in moments of war. When people take modern ancestry tests, the results often surprise them. A trace of distant heritage, a connection to a region never expected. But these aren't random discoveries. They are echoes of history, evidence of how populations moved, collided, and blended over time. After events like the migration period, Europe's genetic landscape shifted permanently. Tribes didn't just replace one another, they merged. The DNA of modern populations still reflects those movements, carrying markers from multiple ancient groups that once clashed and later coexisted. Across Eurasia, the legacy of the Mongol expansions remains visible today. Genetic studies have shown patterns that trace back to this era of rapid conquest and mass relocation. What was once an empire built by force has become part of the biological identity of millions. In the Americas, the impact of the transatlantic slave trade created one of the most complex genetic mosaics in history. African, European, and indigenous ancestries became intertwined under extreme conditions. Today, descendants carry these blended lineages, often discovering connections that history did not clearly preserve. Even global conflicts like World War II left genetic traces. Displacement, refugee resettlement, and cross-border interactions introduced new layers of diversity into populations. Children born during and after these upheavals carried forward combinations of ancestry that reflected a world in motion. This is what makes DNA powerful. It reveals what history sometimes hides. Migration routes that once stretched across continents are now visible in genetic patterns. A person living in one part of the world may carry markers linked to distant regions not because of recent travel, but because of movements that happened hundreds or even thousands of years ago. Your body is, in a sense, a map, not of countries but of journeys. Each genetic marker is a point on that map. Each variation is a record of adaptation, survival, or encounter. And when those markers are studied together, they tell a story far bigger than any single generation. A story shaped by conflict as much as by culture. War didn't just redraw borders on land. It redrew the boundaries within people. So when you look at your ancestry today, whether through science or story, you're not just looking at where you come from. You're looking at what humanity has been through. Because DNA does not forget. It remembers movement. It remembers survival. And in its own silent way, it remembers war. You are not just a name. You are a continuation. Long before borders defined nations, before passports and labels tried to simplify identity, there were movements, not always chosen, not always understood, but real and lasting. Every generation before you lived through forces that shaped their path: migration, conflict, survival, adaptation. Some stayed rooted. Others were pushed across lands they never planned to see. And in those moments, identity changed. Not all at once, but slowly, quietly, across time. What you carry today is the result of those moments. History is not just something that happened, it is something that continues. When populations shifted during events like the migration period, entire identities were reshaped. Tribes blended, cultures merged, and new lineages formed. People who were once strangers became connected through generations that followed. Across continents, the impact of the transatlantic slave trade created identities that could not be traced in a straight line. Names were lost, languages disappeared, but something deeper remained, carried forward in blood, in features, in resilience. Even in global conflicts like World War II, millions were displaced, forcing encounters that would never have happened otherwise. Children born from those moments carried mixed history stories not written in textbooks, but embedded in who they are. This is the truth we often overlook. You are not just from one place. You are from many moments, Moments of movement, moments of loss, moments of survival. Every war that shifted a border, shifted people. And when people moved, they met. And when they met, they changed each other culturally, socially, and biologically. That change did not disappear. It continued. Through generations, through families, through you. Your identity is not a fixed point, it is a timeline. A living connection between the past and the present. And even if you don't know every detail of your ancestry, even if history feels distant or incomplete, it does not mean it is gone. It means it is hidden in plain sight. In your features, in your heritage, in your DNA. You are the evidence that history happened. Not just in books, not just in monuments, but in people. So when you look at yourself, you are not just seeing who you are today. You are seeing the result of everything that came before. Every movement, every struggle, every survival. You are history still alive.